is a blocking call, meaning it's blocking that calling thread. You might be thinking to yourself, well, hey, wait a minute, that's okay. Or rather, maybe it's not as bad because we use configure await false here. So we know we didn't return to the calling thread. And so we know by the time we hit this line of code that this is not the UI thread. This is not thread 1's going to hit here. This is going to be thread 7. And minimum refresh time is running on thread 2. So while yes, it's blocking, it's not necessarily bad for our UI. Well, you're right. And kudos to you if you spotted that. But the problem here is we're still using 2 threads for this one task when we should only really be using 1. And so even if you don't do any UI development in C#, maybe all of your work is done on a ASP.NET Core API, well, this stuff still matters because with .wait, even in your ASP.NET Core API, you're going to be using 2 threads when you only need to be using 1. And this gets dangerous because thread pools are finite. When our .NET app runs, the .NET runtime quickly looks at our CPU, our memory, basically all the specs in our computer to determine how many threads it should spin up. And it can only spin up a finite number of threads in the thread pool. And as we start consuming those threads, eventually we'll run out if we have too many operations going on in parallel. And that's what's known as thread pool exhaustion. So even if you don't use an app that has a UI and you don't have to worry about the main thread, .wait is still very dangerous because for your ASP.NET Core app that maybe gets hundreds of API calls a second, we don't want to use 2 threads every time we only need to be using 1 because we'll quickly reach thread pool exhaustion. So again, the fix here is to just await it. And we can also add in configure await false here as well. Now, there's one other really cool thing with configure await. This is actually new that was introduced in .NET 8, so still pretty recent. And that is the enum configure await options. So instead of saying configure await false, we could say configure await options dot, and I could say here, continue on captured context. Continue on captured context is literally the same thing as configure await true, which is also just the default. So by putting nothing here, this is equal to configure await true. And if we didn't want to say configure await true, we could say configure await options dot continue on captured context. And both of these, configure await true and continue on captured context, tell .NET to say, or tell .NET that when this task is finished running, when get top stories finishes, then return to the calling thread, continue back on that captured context. So this would cause thread 1 to jump back in and continue running our code, which is not necessarily what we want. So for us, I'm going to say configure await options dot none. And this is a little bit confusing. It's a little unintuitive, but configure await options dot none is the same as configure await false, whereas configure await true is the same as continue on captured context. Why would we do this instead of just saying true and false? Why are we wasting all these keystrokes? Well, there's cool things we can do here with the configure await options. And because they're flags, I can chain them together and I can say configure await options dot force yielding along with configure await options dot none. So what now is going to happen when the calling thread hits this await keyword? Well, it knows it's not going to return to the calling thread. So we know we're going to continue on to a background thread. And by saying force yielding, this tells .NET, it says, hey, even if this task is already completed, yield anyways. Go ahead and switch away from the calling thread just to free up thread 1 for a little bit. This is a fun trick that I use in my mobile app sometime as well, because again, not every time the user does a pull to refresh, will I need to go out to the internet and update data because I'm saving that data locally in a cache. So I'm just going to pull it from my cache. I can get it really quickly. But if I don't yield thread 1, well, thread 1's then not able to update the UI to show that spinning activity indicator. So even if we do want to return to the calling thread, with, say, continue on captured context, we can also say force yielding. And this is essentially the same as saying await task.yield. So task.yield equals configure await options.force yielding. We'll say configure await false is equal to configure await options.none. There we go. And configure await true is equal to configure await options dot continue on captured context. So far, we've gone over 3 out of the 4 configure await options, and they all have an equivalent already that exists in .NET that you might have taken advantage of already. But there's a new one. And to be honest, I don't recommend this one. This one actually terrifies me. But there's also suppress throwing. So remember when we were talking about async await earlier, and we were showing how the compiler generates code called, or rather, compiler generates a method called moveNext inside of our iasync state machine. And that moveNext method wraps all of our code inside a try-catch block. And that's fine as long as we await the task, because the await keyword ensures that that exception gets rethrown. Well, if for some reason you never want to see an exception, you can say suppress throwing, and that'll ensure that the exception always gets suppressed and your code will always continue on. So be careful with this. There's very few contexts where I can see myself using this. For the most part, anytime I see suppress throwing inside of a pull request, that's going to be a pretty immediate code smell unless the author has a really valid reason for using it. Now, you also see I'm getting a yellow squiggle here, and this is because configure await options.suppress throwing is only supported for non-generic tasks. So because get top stories returns a task of type frozen set of type story model, suppress throwing actually won't work here. And that's what it's yelling at me for. But if this was just, say, task.delay, for example, if we were down here, there we go, no yellow squiggles, totally valid. So again, we can use configure await false, or if you want to get a little bit more functionality out of your async await and your tasks and what happens with the threading under the hood, we can leverage configure await options. But for the most part, I just use configure await false. So let's go ahead and put these back here. There we go. And we're on to our next to-do.